This video is focusing in on a couple different processes of the heart, and we're going to start off by going over the pressure volume loop. Alright, and so within this pressure volume loop, the x-axis, we have volume of the left ventricle, and the y-axis, we have the pressure of the left ventricle. And so if we start at A here, this is, or VF. VF is where the mitral valve opens and passive ventricle filling begins, which is phase A. So over time, the ventricle's filling with blood passively, nothing's forcing it in there. And then at M, the mitral valve closes, and this is where we enter the isovolumetric contraction. So this is phase B. This is where pressures increase in the left ventricle, but volume is going to stay constant. And this is because both valves on either side of the ventricle are closed. And then once this ventricular pressure exceeds the pressure of the aorta, right outside of the left ventricle, then this is where AO, where the aortic valve opens and ejection begins, which is phase C. And so during phase C, blood is pushed out of the left ventricle and volume will decrease in the left ventricle until the aortic valve closes again, and that's labeled by AC. And then at phase D, this is isovolumetric relaxation. This is where pressure falls and the mitral valve eventually reopens, restarting the whole cycle. And the cool thing about this, it's very similar to just a normal time with pressure volume of the cardiac cycle, but this one removes the time aspect, so it's just showing that this is the cycle that's going to repeat over and over and over again every time your heart beats. Continuing with this picture, we're going to talk about a few key points within this sketch. We have preload, afterload, and inotropy. And so preload is going to refer to the ventricle at the end of diastole, which is essentially the end diastolic volume. And so that's over here. So the more preload means a stronger contraction. And then moving on to afterload is the resistance the heart must overcome to eject blood. And this is represented by arterial elastance. So if afterload increases, more pressure is needed to eject the same volume. So stroke volume may drop. And then inotropy is the strength of contraction. And it's shown by the slope of the line here. An increase in inotropy, from a sympathetic stimulation or an increased amount of calcium intracellular, will increase stroke volume by ejecting more blood, the same preload. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about mean arterial pressure, or MAP. So MAP is calculated by your cardiac output multiplied by your peripheral resistance, meaning resistance on the outside of your arteries. And so we've got this little equation here, MAP times cardiac output, or MAP equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. And we're going to get peripheral resistance from this little equation, 8 times your viscosity times your length divided by pi r cubed to the fourth. And so actually peripheral resistance is resistance from your blood flowing through, how thick it is, how long the artery is, how wide your arteries are as well. So mean arterial pressure is a measure of the average pressure in the arteries, where cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume, and PR is this equation here. During exercise, we're going to have both heart rate and stroke volume increasing, which will increase cardiac output, and then it also increase mean arterial pressure. And so then if arterioles constrict from an effect from the SNS, then mean arterial pressure also increases. And so mean arterial pressure basically ensures that organs will receive consistent perfusion or persistent oxygen getting to the organs. And so there's a little graph here showing that as we move from the aorta down to the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins, or venules, veins, and back to the right heart, the pressure will slowly drop as we go further. Basically, just because the length it's getting further from that initial pump, that initial pressure. Alright, now talking a little bit about the baroreceptor reflex. So baroreceptor reflex is going to regulate short-term changes in blood pressure. These receptors in the aortic notch and carotid sinuses detect pressure changes through the stretch and through the change in pressure. So when we have an increase in stretch or a higher blood pressure, this leads to more action potentials through the cranial nerves that innervate these baroreceptors. And this sends a signal up to the medulla, which will increase your parasympathetic nervous system, which will then, and also reduces your sympathetic output. And on the other side, if your heart rate drops, your vessels will dilate, and your blood pressure will then increase. And so then if we have low blood pressure, there's going to be less stretch here in the aorta. We're going to have fewer action potentials within the baroreceptors. And the fewer action potentials with the baroreceptors equals an increased sympathetic activity, leading to heart rate and contractility rise. So heart rate's going to increase, contractions are going to increase. And then so that leads to vasoconstriction occurring and blood pressure increasing. And so this reflex is pretty fast and it occurs within a couple seconds. It's going to create that flow back and forth between what's normal. It's going to go a little bit above, it's going to overcorrect, it's going to overcorrect, it's going to overcorrect, but it's going to stay on average in this middle line. And that's going to happen every few seconds within the body. Alright, finally we're going to talk a little bit about capillary exchange mechanisms. And so within capillary exchange, it's going to be balanced out by 4 different forces. We're going to have your hydrostatic pressure, which is very similar to mean arterial pressure, but it's within capillaries. You're going to have your blood colloid osmotic pressure, you're going to have your interstitial colloid osmotic pressure, and you're going to have your interstitial fluid pressure. And so your hydrostatic pressure is pressure from basically from your it's like your blood pressure, and it's going to be pushing fluid out because it's that buildup of pressure earlier from the arteries leading down all the way to your capillaries. And so that's going to be pushing fluids out of your capillaries, about 30 millimeters of mercury. But then you're going to have your B cop and your I cop, which are more osmotic pressures. And so your B cop is going to be a lot higher than your I cop. Your B cop is your blood colloid osmotic pressure. That's within your capillaries. And it's because you have so many proteins, mostly albumin proteins, within your blood. And these proteins aren't as concentrated on the outside of your capillaries, just in your interstitial fluid. And within that fluid, water is going to want to flow to where there's more proteins, and so water is going to want to flow in to the capillaries. So the B cop pressure is about 28 millimeters of mercury, and on the outside, since there's such few proteins comparatively, there's going to be a pressure of about 8 millimeters of mercury. And then finally, we take into account the suction effect of your these little lymph vessels here are going to create your interstitial fluid pressure, which is going to be a pulling out effect of about 3 millimeters of mercury. Altogether, this adds up to about 13 net pulling out millimeters of mercury, which is good because you want to be pulling out. You want to have that section to pull out that oxygen to allow your cells to get the oxygen that they need. And so one example of edema, or the filling up of fluid on the interstitial space, is chronic malnutrition, specifically malnutrition by lack of protein. And this is a good example, especially in third world countries where they're getting plenty of carbohydrates and maybe plenty of fats, but they're not getting enough protein, which means these proteins, which get replenished almost daily, aren't able to be replenished. And so when you have a drop of your albumin in your blood, that means you're going to also have a drop in your B cop, which then leads to a higher net out. This number would then increase. And when that number increases, it leads to an excess amount of fluid in your interstitial space. And that's why in a lot of third world countries you see little kids that have really bloated bellies, because those are prone to already holding on to extra fluid, and really bloated or swollen feet, because that's where you're feeling the most effective gravity, and so that fluid's going to be able to pull out and then pull up down there as well. So that's an example of edema within this exchange here in the capillaries.